I guess I should begin from the beginning. I was born February 28th, 1923, in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and my name at that time, which is written in this particular book, which I have kept all these years, because it dates my birth, my brother who I had to have, who was deceased, and my mother and father's matrimonial dates. And I even have the telegram that says, es una nena, meaning it is a girl. We did live in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. My mother, my brother, and myself. And we did not come to the United States until I was 6 months old. It's written up in Ellis Island that we came. We came by ship. And those days it took about, well, at least 18 to 23 days. My father was a prompter in the Yiddish theater. How he became a prompter in Argentina, I'll never know. But he did meet my mother in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. My first recollection is when I was 3 years old, and my brother, may he rest in peace, was 6 years older than I was. He was 9. He had an acute appendicitis. The only thing that I remember is them taking him out on a stretcher in the hallway. And unfortunately, he died in the hospital. It was winter working in the United States, and being that there was no work during the summer and it was winter in Argentina, my father used to take a Yiddish star, quote unquote, and they used to perform in Yiddish theater in Argentina. So that's where he used to go. So when my brother passed away, unfortunately, my father was not, he was in Argentina. This book was made by my son Charles for my 80th birthday. All right? And of course it says Sophia, which I was born with, also in Hebrew, Jean Fidelman Kopelman Haber. I think it's important to say that, of course, I was born with the name of Sophia. And being Jewish, there's always a Yiddish name, so that my name was Shendel. That was my Hebrew Jewish name. My father's cousin, they were all in the United States. Her Yiddish name was also Shendel. And she's decided that Sophia was not an American name. Her name was Jenny, so being that the Yiddish names were the same, they decided to call me Jenny. My mother was very anxious to see her own mother. Her father had passed away. So we took a boat, she took me, and it took 18 days from New York to go to Argentina. And I was at that time about 10 years old. So we took, and we did stop in different places. The boat did stop. We stopped in Rio de Janeiro, which is in Brazil. We stopped in Santos, which is in Brazil, and went off the ship and what have you. And we also went to Montevideo, which is in Uruguay, and then we finally hit Buenos Aires. So I started to go to school in Argentina. And we stayed in Argentina for about 1.5 years. And I learned Spanish very, very easily, because when we used to go to the movies, my cousin Aida, who is still living, who I'm still in touch with, when I used to go to the movies with her, my mother used to say, "Tell me what you saw, what was the story?" And I wasn't able to talk in English anymore. She says, "Tell me in English." And then I had another cousin, which was my age, my cousin Beatrice, who was also, God bless her, still living, because of my mother's there were 5 sisters, 3 of them were pregnant at the same time. And my father was living there for a while also, but then he had to come back to the United States for the winter work. And we didn't have enough money to come book passage. So I remember as if it was yesterday, my mother and I went to the American consulate. Don't forget, I was an American citizen on my father's papers. So we said, we have no money to go back to the United States. And in those days, you didn't fly. You took the boat, the ship, I should say. And they paid. Of course, we were Americans, and we were stranded, supposedly, and they paid. I will never forget the experience of coming back on that ship. It was 18 days, don't forget, on the ship. And in those days, you didn't have your own cabins. All the women slept together, sort of in bunk beds. And the men had another room with their bunk beds because, like my mother used to say, we went 3rd class because there wasn't a 4th. And my father was engaged in one of the theaters, in Boston, and we lived in Dorchester, 60 Harvard Street. That's where we lived, in Dorchester. When Rima, who was my daughter, and Roger lived in Philadelphia, and they had Melissa, who was my granddaughter, my first granddaughter. And I used to go to Philadelphia quite often to take care of Melissa. And I used to walk by 624 Spruce Street and wondered who lived there. Things you can remember, that we used to give away free shoes to the poor kids. And I used to help the little kids put the shoes on to see which fit them and whatever. The thing that stay in your mind. So when I started school, whoever decided that they did not like the name of Jenny. So they said, why don't you call her Jean? So my mother said, okay, Jean is a nice name, so we'll call her Jean. So of course I went from Sophia to Jenny, and then I went to Jean. My mother decided that she had to find some sort of work. So she registered with the Wilford Academy of Beauty. It was to learn how to become a beautician. And being that my mother was not a learned person in English, I used to help her. So I learned at that time everything that a beautician had to learn. Okay, then my father got a job in New York City. So we moved from Philadelphia and we moved to New York City. And that was the first time that I can remember that we had our own apartment. We had a 3-room apartment. I slept in the living room, and my father and mother slept in the bedroom, and we sort of had a kitchen as you walked in. I have a cousin who is a very famous writer, unfortunately, he passed away. His name was Bernard Malamud. Now, Bernard Malamud's mother and my father were sister and brother. And his mother, which I remember, unfortunately died in a mental institution. He was very, very close to my father. He didn't call him Charles, he called him by his Yiddish name, which was Casil. He came to our house very, very often. In fact, he used the name Fidelman very often. One particular book was written in my mother's apartment because my mother used to go to work and he had no place to write, so he wrote The Tenant in that apartment. He was very good to my mother, He was very good to me and to my children. Loved my children. From Brooklyn, we moved to Manhattan. And as I said before, we had our own apartment on East 13th Street, between 1st and 2nd Avenue. Because my father worked on 2nd Avenue, there used to be a lot of Yiddish theaters. My father worked at nights. During the day, they used to rehearse, and then they used to have the plays. So he worked with a lot of the Yiddish actors. That my father was a very, very intelligent person. But he had written 2 plays, and those 2 plays I donated to near the museum on 16th Street to Yiddish. I donated those 2 plays because they were all in Yiddish. Next door to our house where we lived, the apartment house, was a candy store. And at that time, we did not have our own telephone. So if somebody called us, the man that owned Mr. Schuss, who was an older man, used to come around and ring our bell 3 times to know that there was a telephone call downstairs in his store. Now the boys, the young men and the girls, used to hang out. This was our hangout. Now, one of the fellows took a liking to me. He was 19. He was a plumber. And he worked for his father, who had his place of business across the street from where I lived. Louis Rossman, his name was. I went with him steady, supposedly, for 4 years. My father was first of all, he was very literate. And no one was good enough for his one daughter. I was the only child. And he didn't like the idea that I was going with a plumber. And he was very particular the way he dressed. Although he gave his shirts or his underwear to the Chinese laundry in those days, which was 2 doors down, when it came back, he had to stand and iron, if God forbid there was a crease. And for a man who came so many years ago and was involved in Yiddish, my father spoke a perfect English and read an English paper besides a Yiddish paper. And I happened to have gotten sick. I had rheumatic fever, and I had gotten sick, and I was in bed. And this Louis, I went with him for 3-4 years. He knew that my father resented him. And because I was sick and I wouldn't be around, so to speak, I had to lay in bed at the time, he broke up with me. I was heartbroken. After I graduated, say from high school, I went to work because money was needed in the house to be able to sustain myself even. So I got a job, all right, working in an office. And the man said, okay, in those days, believe it or not, it was $10 a week. So I used to go to modeling school at night. And I used to learn how to walk and everything else, and I got a diploma for it. Now I'm going to go get a modeling job. But again, it was during the war, the end of the war. And they didn't have enough film. So I got a job, finally. It was called Farquharson and Wheelock. It was on 57th Street, and it was the type like you see in the movies, that you walk on a podium and you model the clothes. But I was happy to get a job, at least, as a model. Now, my mother had gone to the country to spend a week in the country in those days. They used to go up to the Catskills, spend a week. And she met this couple up there who were very friendly to her. My father did not go, my mother just went. So she said, you know what, you're going to Brooklyn this couple lives a couple of streets away. Go say hello. So I said, okay. And I went over to meet this couple just to say hello. And it was before Jewish holidays or something. So we go upstairs and I get introduced to her brother. And who was sitting there? The people that lived there. The mother and father, Mr. and Mrs. Spatz. And the son and daughter-in-law. He says to me, where do you live? I says, I live on 13th Street in Manhattan. He says, isn't that funny? I live with my in-laws on 15th Street. How would you like to meet my brother-in-law? So I said, sure, why not? We're going to have a dance, he says, on October the 12th. Why don't you come to the dance and I'll introduce you to my brother-in-law? So I said, okay. Besides the girls going, I was supposed to go with some fellow, one of the boys of the group. And he changed his mind for whatever. So I said, you know what? The girls will go by themselves. So I said, I'm supposed to meet somebody here. But to tell you the truth, it was 6 weeks ago. I don't know what the fellow even that I spoke to that had the brother-in-law, as I don't even know what he looks like. Meanwhile, we're very busy dancing with everybody else under the sun and whatever it is. Towards the end of the evening, this man comes over to me. He says, are you Jean? I said, yes. He said, I'm Irving. Wait a minute, I'll introduce you to my brother-in-law. And this was Dutch.